First, the reason I even stepped into the whole cannabis field was, in the early 90s with the demonstration in rats and mice and rodents that when you give THC, the primary psychoactive component of cannabis, chronically to animals and then give them an antagonist, something that kicks THC off the cannabinoid receptor, animals go through this precipitated withdrawal. And at the time, it was stunning to us because, like you, I didn't really think or didn't know of a cannabis withdrawal syndrome.
Welcome to High Five with Dr. Igor Grant, Distinguished Professor of Psychiatry and Director of the Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research at UC San Diego. Each episode will take you on a fascinating journey into the evolving world of medicinal cannabis, as Dr. Grant poses 5 thought-provoking questions to his guest, uncovering their personal journey and unique contributions to the field. Now, here's your host, Dr. Igor Grant.
Today, we will be speaking with Professor Meg Haney. Professor Haney is Professor of Neurobiology in the Department of Psychiatry at Columbia University. She's also the co-director of the Cannabis Research Laboratory and Substance Use Research Center, where she conducts research into cannabis use disorder and the potential therapeutic effects of cannabis and its constituents in human health.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
So one of your areas of interest, you have many areas of interest, but we're going to focus today on one of them, has been cannabis use disorder. Maybe to start, can you just explain to our audience, what is cannabis use disorder? How is it diagnosed clinically?
It's a really important topic because I think the public is, I often get pushback, is there such a thing as addiction and so forth? And so I always like to be, very straightforward about cannabis use disorder. Like other substance use disorder, cannabis use disorder is characterized by, a preoccupation, foregoing other important things in one's life. Cannabis use disorder is for those who are using enough cannabis that is causing disruption and causing, problems in their own life. So, it's very much like all substance use disorders, patient-driven. There are people who smoke an enormous amount of cannabis and report that it has no negative impact on their life, so they wouldn't meet criteria often for cannabis use disorder. But it's like other substance use disorder. It's craving, it's disruption, it's foregoing other events. It's having a negative impact on one's life. Early on, I got really interested in the demonstration of cannabis withdrawal, which is another component of a substance use disorder. There's a withdrawal syndrome to cannabis. It's very surprising to people, unless they smoke a lot of cannabis or they live with someone who smokes a lot of cannabis and they see what happens when somebody stops smoking cannabis. So, I'm happy to talk more about that, but that really started my whole interest in this whole area of research.
Yeah, so that's very interesting. So basically, cannabis use disorder has to do with a sort of preoccupation and focus on cannabis, maybe beginning to, affect other things,
right.
A
Exactly.
real preoccupation with it, right?
Right, exactly.
So you actually anticipated another question I was going to ask you, and that is, as a child of the 60s myself, the popular lore was, well, heroin, alcohol, barbiturates, they produce this physical dependency, but cannabis doesn't. It's kind of a psychological dependency. Unclear what that meant exactly. But anyway, basically, there were not biological aspects to cannabis dependency. And you're saying that's actually not true. Can you explain that a little more?
Yeah, exactly. So first, the reason I even stepped into the whole cannabis field was, in the early 90s with the demonstration in rats and mice and rodents that when you give THC, the primary psychoactive component of cannabis, chronically to animals and then give them an antagonist, something that kicks THC off the cannabinoid receptor, animals go through this precipitated withdrawal. And at the time, it was stunning to us because, like you, I didn't really think or didn't know of a cannabis withdrawal syndrome. So that literally got me started in this whole field because we have this residential laboratory at Columbia. It's a really unique and special place where we have non-treatment seeking heavy cannabis users move into the lab. They live with us and we collect their behavior around the clock. So sleep, mood, food intake, cognitive task performance, everything they do, we're monitoring and we give them cannabis and we look at the direct effects of cannabis. But then in our early studies, we had people smoking cannabis daily And then we switched the active cannabis to placebo cannabis and just documented over time all of these behaviors. And that's where we could really see a pharmacologically specific withdrawal syndromes. What first happens is people stop eating. It's really remarkable. Food intake drops by 1,000 calories a day on average, for the first 1 to 2 days of cannabis abstinence. Then sleep is also disrupted, and sleep is a very robust cannabis withdrawal syndrome. So sleep is disrupted really for quite a while. It comes on quickly. People can't fall asleep, stay asleep. They wake up early. Sleep is really disrupted. Then the mood stuff happens. So for like we're peaking around days 3, 4, and 5, they're terribly irritable. There's anxiety. Irritability is probably the primary symptom that we witness. But, there's all these mood consequences. And so these are really I think the primary symptoms of cannabis withdrawal. And the reason we know it's not just people being grumpy because they're not doing what they love to do is if you give them very low doses of oral THC, not enough to get them intoxicated, all their withdrawal symptoms go away. So they're sleeping well, they're eating normally, just back to baseline levels, but they don't feel, they can't even tell whether they're getting placebo or oral THC. So we know that this is a pharmacologically specific effect. It has a time course. It remits like a withdrawal syndrome should. So, usually by about 7 to 10 days, most withdrawal symptoms are gone. Sleep, there's some good evidence. Sleep stays disrupted for quite a while, particularly nightmares. That's a kind of, it's interesting because THC suppresses REM. So when you take it off, there's this, rebound effect where, there's more REM sleep, and it seems to be nightmares in particular. And that seems to last for weeks. It's something very interesting. Sleep and irritability, I would say, are really the defining characteristics, which is why I say for those who live with a heavy cannabis smoker, they hate when they try to stop because they're tough to live with, and they're tough for us to live with in the lab too, because we usually have, as I say, they're staying with us in this setting for a week to 2 weeks. And boy, they can be tough on those days that they're really going through withdrawal.
Yeah. And so when you talk about REM, just for our audience, that's rapid eye movement sleep. It's a phase of sleep that occurs more in the later part of sleep, typically where people have dreams and
right.
It turns out their eyeballs move. That's why.
Yes, right.
But that's all that moves, right? Otherwise, you're kind of paralyzed.
Exactly. And, so what's intriguing too is a lot of people use cannabis to sleep. They think it's helping them sleep, and it probably helps them fall asleep. But in the long term, it's not a great sleep medication because it is disrupting the normal cycles of sleep. It's not a good strategy. And it's not uncommon for people to say, well, I need cannabis to sleep. And it's like, well, that's because you probably have developed a bit of a dependency on it. And so what you're experiencing when you don't use cannabis is a little withdrawal syndrome where sleep is disrupted. So you do need it to sleep. You kind of need to go a long period to abstain before your sleep normalizes again.
Yeah. And while we're on that, how would whatever the hypnotic, if you will, effects are of THC, is it similar to, say, Ambien, sleeping pills, things like that?
I don't know if Ambien maintains the normal cycles of sleep, but again, THC does not. I don't know enough about Ambien, but
I meant just any sleep.
Yeah. So, I think the orexin antagonists are the ones that kind of, if I'm recalling correctly, are the ones that help people sleep, but it normalizes sleep rather than suppressing and disrupting the cycle. So, yeah. So again, I don't think it's the greatest approach to sleep, unless you on occasion, but it's to use it daily for sleep probably isn't the greatest thing because you're going to become a bit dependent on that, I think, for sleep.
Now, is part of the withdrawal also people, you said they get grumpy and irritable. Is anxiety part of it?
It is. It is a significant symptom of cannabis withdrawal. Again, not for everybody. I think it varies with what your biology is, but anxiety is certainly one of the symptoms of withdrawal. So, it's kind of, there's no free lunch in this world, like the opponent process theory. Whatever you're using your particular recreational drug for, you're going to pay for it with the opposite effect when you're going through withdrawal. So again, people use alcohol for its anxiolytic effects, and certainly one is familiar with anxiety, and the opposite will happen when you're going through withdrawal. And I think that's similar to cannabis, that whatever the acute effects are, once you develop a dependency, when you abstain, you're going to go through the worst of all those symptoms.
Now, among some of the other drugs that produce dependency, such as alcohol, nicotine, opioids, obviously, sleeping pills, barbiturates, things like that, the effects can be quite dramatic, whereas with cannabis, they're a bit milder. First of all, is that true? And secondly, is it because THC and the cannabinoids hang around a long time because they sit around in your fat cells?
Exactly. Yeah. So, what I liken it to, and others have too, is certainly so with tobacco, right? So that withdrawal comes on very quickly. Cigarette smokers have to use repeatedly throughout the day, or they get very uncomfortable. Where it does take longer definitely does take longer because of that lipophilicity and that the fact that it's sitting around and slowly leaves the body. So it's not as dramatic a withdrawal syndrome. I often, again, one of the questions I get from reporters is like, well, it's all psychological. How meaningful is it? And, again, I look at cigarettes. Look how fierce, that dependency, that use disorder is. It's hard, very hard for people to stop smoking cigarettes. And they're not convulsing or, having intense diarrhea or, many of the more severe withdrawal syndromes you could see, obviously, with benzodiazepines or alcohol, obviously, the more life-threatening ones. But, I think that emotional component of withdrawal is probably the most, for many, a very, very profound aspect of withdrawal. So, I think I've read even with heroin, which has a more physiological withdrawal syndrome, it's that deep anxiety, the discomfort they're feeling emotionally that is worse than the flu-like symptoms they go through. So it's these are profound symptoms for people. So, but I don't want to overstate cannabis use disorder or its withdrawal syndrome. It's not life-threatening. It is these psychological symptoms. And and it's not as disruptive to one's life as disruptive is not the right word, but I'm not saying it's equivalent to opioid use disorder or alcohol use disorder. For me, what's important is just getting the message out to the public that it exists. And if you're using cannabis, I don't care if it's therapeutic reasons or recreational reasons. If you're using it repeatedly throughout the day, every day, this is a risk, and nobody wants a use disorder. So my sense is that it's not discussed enough, and I don't know if clinicians discuss it at all because they might not be aware of it. And I think everyone should know if you're going to be using cannabis for pain or to treat, what you think it's going to be helpful for, and as I said, you're using it repeatedly throughout the day as one would for a pain medication. Know that this is a risk that you might develop a use disorder, which means it's going to take on a large part of your daily life and, your psyche around the use. I just wish we had a more honest conversation about the pros and the cons of cannabis, because I feel like it's, as probably more than anyone, having studied it for so long, it is such a polarizing substance, and people think it's all good or it's all bad. And it's clearly both. It has, effects that are therapeutic. It has effects that can produce a use disorder. So you just want your eyes wide open whenever you're using a substance of abuse.
Right. Well, one of our hopes at CMCR is to have less heat and more light.
Yes.
If I could put it that way. And it is, you're right. It's sometimes hard to have a conversation because physiological aspects of this get all tied up with, issues of attitude and morality.
And I also think that there's this dichotomy that people think it's therapeutic or it's, recreational or non-therapeutic. And it's very, very blurry. Those lines are extremely blurry. So that's a simplistic too, the way we discuss it as a medicine versus a substance of abuse.
Now, there have been various estimates of cannabis use disorder, ranging from one figure that's often quoted as 9%. I always am curious how that very specific number, why don't they say about 10 or about 5, whatever. And then some estimates go a lot higher. What's your take on that, and why this variability? Why is this?
I mean, that 1 in 9 was a very, very old epidemiological study, very important, but very old. And, at Columbia, we have Debbie Hassan, who really studies the epidemiology of cannabis use disorder. And, it's certainly, the numbers are much higher for those. The 1 in 9 was you used once, I believe, that's the likelihood you'll go on to develop a use disorder. But, what's more potentially relevant is those that use it a little more often than that. So, I think she goes up to 20 20% or even higher, perhaps. I don't have the numbers right on the top of my head because the other, this is inside baseball perhaps, but the other thing is, the definition of cannabis use disorder has changed over the years. So it used to be that by DSM-4 criteria, it was abuse versus dependence, and that had a set of criteria. But with now cannabis use disorder, you can meet criteria by just having 2 symptoms. And those symptoms could be craving and tolerance, which could be easy to develop. So it's easier to meet a criteria for cannabis use disorder. So one of the things I'm really interested in is, because one of my interests is this very high rates of cannabis use disorder among those who use it therapeutically. And but I want to be, clear-eyed about it. If the vast majority have mild cannabis use disorder and they're feeling a therapeutic effect, it might be worth it for them to, the point is, how distressing is it for them? So I think the vast majority who meet criteria for cannabis use disorder who are using it therapeutically, I think 56% have this mild cannabis use disorder, which for me is not wildly concerning. It's more the moderate or the severe, where you're meeting many more criteria, much more disruption in one's life. That's the number that's of interest to me. So that's going to be, still 30-40% of people using it, medically. So that's the group I really want to focus on and communicate that, again, if it's causing disruption with your spouse and with your job and all these other things that one can see if they have a use disorder, I think that's really one. So I don't want to conflate, cannabis use disorder and therapeutic use if it's mostly the mild symptoms, but more moderate and severe cannabis use disorder is clinically meaningful.
Yeah. Well, and of course, it's complicated by the fact that, if one is using cannabis medicinally, and if you have a background of psychological issues or problems, let's say anxiety, depression, and so forth, that may kind of make it even more likely that one develops a disorder. Is that true? Yeah.
Absolutely. If you have a psychiatric condition, the likelihood of you developing cannabis use disorder is much, much higher. The very sad thing for me in this, in this current state of affairs where studying cannabis is so incredibly difficult scientifically, it's really open now for, snake oil salesmen to take over. That it's, in the absence of data, there's the charlatans can really step in. And the thing that's very, very sad for me is that when you look at the top 3 reasons people are seeking medical cannabis, I think the first 2 are depression and anxiety. And there is no good evidence that they're efficacious for those 2. And in fact, I think that sets you up for a worse outcome. Yet people are seeking it for that. And they likely feel better acutely. I often say, I have a glass of wine on a stressful day and I feel therapy. I feel like the anxiolytic effects, my anxiety goes down, but nobody's saying that's my medicine. Nobody says drink every day for your anxiety. It's not a long-term solution. And so just because you feel better at the moment doesn't mean it's a medicine for you. I am distressed by the numbers using it for anxiety and depression because I don't think it's going to help for that.
Fair enough. Now, you've been also working on approaches to treat cannabis use disorder, including developing new medications. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's been really the biggest focus of our lab as we look at in this inpatient setting. We maintain these heavy cannabis users, in one phase, they'll be on placebo medication, and another phase, they'll move into the lab on active medication. And while they're in the lab, we have them, as I say, smoking cannabis. So we can see what the medication does to cannabis intoxication. But we also have them abstain from cannabis so we can measure the effects of medication on withdrawal symptoms. So we can capture kind of both ends, because when you're developing a medication for a substance use disorder, you got to decide what you're targeting. Are you targeting the intoxication, trying to reduce that, like naltrexone or naloxone would for opioid use disorder? Or are you trying to mitigate withdrawal symptoms and hope that you can get people who are trying to abstain longer? So that's been we've tested loads of medications in this approach, and probably not surprisingly to many, the most effective for attenuating withdrawal and decreasing the likelihood that people will return to cannabis use in our laboratory setting is Nabilone, which is agonist like oral THC, but it seems it's a little bit better than dronabinol or oral THC because it lasts a very long time and you only have to take it once a day, but it just really mitigates all the withdrawal symptoms. And in our lab model, it decreases use. So this hasn't been tested in the gold standard, the randomized controlled clinical trial, but like with many drugs of abuse, an agonist or, a drug that is an oral medication, which with a longer, onset and duration of action, they work well. Methadone works very well, actually. So, and varenicline and the nicotine replacement strategies, that is a pretty solid approach. What's been much harder to do for cannabis is to find a medication that decreases the intoxication. We have fewer tools for that, but yeah, with my colleagues at ALS Pharma in France, they discovered this new medication, this pregnenolone analog that significantly decreases. We have people smoke active cannabis and, at the higher dose, that high was reduced by 38%. And then they also decreased their self-administration of cannabis. So that was a really exciting study because I don't have a chance to really see anything that works really well for that. We tried cannabidiol and it didn't do anything. That was a recent study that was an exciting one. So that led to a large multi-site clinical trial. And, the results of that haven't been released yet. I think that's going to really inform our understanding of cannabis use disorder because it was, I think, 330 people are enrolled across the United States. So that's going to really inform our approach to that.
Pregnenolone, that is a steroid, right? And some of it is naturally produced in our body?
Yes, and it's a precursor to a lot of very active hormones, estrogen, testosterone. So it's a precursor hormone. So that's why we didn't want to give pregnenolone directly. The idea was, first of all, you don't want to, it doesn't last very long when you give it, by itself. And also you run the risk of it producing, all these other active hormones. So that's why they developed this analog that doesn't have that effect. Yet it binds to this particular pocket in the cannabinoid receptor that by binding there, it's really blocking many of the intoxicating effects of cannabis without producing all of the side effects that we know rimonabant, this competitive antagonist, does. You can't block the cannabinoid receptor without experiencing a whole lot of really negative side effects. So this medication has this very cool little workaround where it's not blocking the receptor, just binding a pocket of it, shutting down a little bit of the activity, but not all of it. Because, as you know, this cannabinoid receptor it's one of the most, I think the most common G protein coupled receptor in the brain. So it's playing a very important role in a range of physiological effects. So you can't shut it down, but you can tweak it. And that seems to be.
Again, just I'm sure most of our audience know what receptors are, but just as a very simple analogy, it's kind of like a lock and key thing where THC in this case would be the key moving into a lock on a brain cell or whatever it may be. Right. And then you're saying that the pregnenolone analog molecule kind of goes to just one part of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And disables it partially somehow.
Yes. Yeah. And so that when THC binds or when our own, natural THC-like chemicals that we produce in the brain, and when they bind to this protein, this receptor, they can produce their effects. But the intoxicating effects seems to be the one thing that you can shut down with this pregnenolone analog, or not shut down, but really change the way THC feels in a way that we hope will make it less of a robust reinforcer.
Right. Good. Could I just then ask you about another area that I know has been an interest of yours, and that is how the use of other drugs of abuse might intersect with concurrent cannabis use, for example, tobacco, cocaine, etc. Can you say a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, we, kind of by chance, which is, again, what's so exciting about science is you go in with an idea and you get a completely different answer that just sets off a whole new area of research. But, we have been doing these withdrawal studies for a long time, and these self-administration studies where we have people decide whether they're going to actually use cannabis in the laboratory. And so we put them all together and said, what predicts this model of relapse? What predicts whether people who are abstinent will return to cannabis use? In this model we have, So we put everything in we put it all in there, all peak withdrawal symptoms, all the demographic data, assuming that those who suffer worse withdrawal are going to be the ones that go back to, that relapse in this model. And much to our surprise, we found that the biggest, by far, like a huge effect size, the biggest predictor of whether you're going to relapse in this model is if you are a tobacco cigarette smoker. Now, people are allowed to smoke in our laboratory. It's not like we're depriving them of tobacco and cannabis. They're smoking normally. But just being a tobacco cigarette smoker predicted this relapse model. And then they started to look at the data, and it turns out across drugs of abuse, being a tobacco cigarette smoker predicts worse outcome in treatment. And so that, was very exciting. So we did these other studies where we enrolled these tobacco cigarette smokers. And in one condition, we had them smoke normally and looked at cannabis relapse. And in another condition, we deprived them of, they had to go through abstain from both. And the reality was thinking maybe nicotine cues cannabis use. So there's some direct effect of nicotine, but it didn't seem to be the case. They all relapsed to cannabis. And whether they were smoking cigarettes or not, they all relapsed to cannabis. So we've gone on to kind of pursue this in an ongoing study. Like, what is it about being a cigarette smoker that, really makes all of your outcome worse? And how long do you have to stop cigarettes for this effect to go away? So that's kind of what we're pursuing now. And our current hypothesis is that the age in which you start smoking tobacco cigarettes, perhaps, that your brain is more vulnerable to a lot of things. And there's interesting preclinical data with this. So we're looking to see if those who started smoking cigarettes really have this persistent likelihood of relapsing to cannabis versus those who started later, but abstained. So we're kind of pursuing this question. So yes, being a tobacco cigarette smoker, you tend to fare worse in treatment. And certainly in our lab model, we're seeing really, really robust relapse to cannabis. So tobacco is really very, very interesting.
So could it possibly be the case then that, some people, they used to call addictive personalities, that isn't used anymore, but is it possible that some people's brains just have more receptors that are really needing these things?
If that's what's so exciting about this finding, because it could just be, you think about if you're a daily cigarette and cannabis user, you're modulating your mood very, very precisely throughout the day. So maybe it's like, emotion dysregulation. It's like being uncomfortable is much more uncomfortable for certain people, or, they're used to kind of titrating all day long their mood. So that would suggest it's that, like, if, then it's you. So this is kind of what our ongoing study is going to say. Like, if you're abstinent for 2 to 3 weeks, are you still, so that you should be over the nicotine stuff by then. Are you still that way? Are you still much more vulnerable? Because that would suggest it is something intrinsic to the individual. Or it may be that if you abstain a long enough time from nicotine, maybe you will look like a non-smoker in the lab. So that this is what we really want to sort out. We're really interested in that.
Right. And as you say, maybe the age of onset and other kinds of things.
I think that really does contribute. I think that's the other kind of tragedy is, of course, with human nature, adolescents are the ones that are experimenting with, that's when this behavior starts. And boy, that brain is vulnerable then. There are 2 times of immense brain development, and that's in utero and that's adolescence. And, touching upon the whole pregnancy issue too, that is a great concern to me. I just read a statistic, like an enormous percentage of pregnant women, particularly at a certain age, are using cannabis to help treat some of their symptoms. Again, even without a whole lot of data, that's concerning, just given this enormous brain development that occurs in utero, and that the development of the cannabinoid receptor system plays an important role in synaptic development and brain development. So I just hate to think of heavy cannabis use occurring then. And dispensaries recommended, and it's, I don't think the public messaging has really gotten out there for the risks of that.
Yeah. Of course, that goes for almost any medications that we, a lot of them, we don't know what they really can do. Yeah.
Right. And you can't really study it, obviously, but I just think that's where I get a little bit more, there's biological plausibility, certainly, of there being some negative consequences.
So maybe I could ask you just fun and outrageous question. What I read was, I'm not a rat researcher or anything, that Actually, it's very hard to get them to take THC. They don't like it. Whereas people seem to. Is there some difference in developmentally in primates?
Rodents, yeah. No, it has been an intriguing thing. I really think it has to do with this lipophilicity, that unlike most other drugs of abuse, almost all of them that I can think of that are water soluble, I think something about this, the fact that it is lipophilic and it's a partial agonist. So more of the recent studies have been looking at vaped THC instead of IV. And, there's one woman who was able to get monkeys to self-administer IV THC, Susanna Justanova. She was at NIDA IRP. She's the only one, I think, but she very robustly was able to show squirrel monkeys self-administering IV THC. So she did develop a model for it. But rodents, it has been very tricky. And I think the latest approach is trying to, mimic more what humans do, which is inhale, smoked, or vaped. And it seems that a lot of the preclinical models are going that way. And there is now evidence that you can get them to press a lever for exposure to that vapor. So it is an ongoing issue. But I do think, and when you use higher efficacy agonists, you can get them, their WIN and these other ones, you can get them to self-administer. But it is very different because animals like all the same drugs we do. So THC has always kind of stood out as different in that sense.
So you're not saying that it's because God made humans special and created THC specially for them. Anyway, on that note, Dr. Haney, is there anything else you'd like to say, things we didn't touch on that you think are important before we wrap it up?
I just very quickly, because I am excited about it. We have a new grant that we're studying because I am interested in, as I said, Ziva Cooper, and it was when she was in our lab, have really studied pain and showing that, either oral THC or smoked cannabis can reduce pain. Of course, we see all these reliable abuse-related effects too. So I really want to do a study. We have the study we're hoping to start soon, giving different types of cannabis, varying in their THC and cannabidiol levels, repeatedly over time, and looking at the development of tolerance to these two indications, because nobody knows if tolerance develops to this analgesic effect of cannabis. And the other thing is what happens when you abruptly stop it. So we have studied this withdrawal syndrome, but we haven't really looked at pain. And our suspicions are that they're hyperalgesic, that when you cut cannabis users off abruptly, that they seem to be more sensitive to pain. So that's clinically really important. And so that's kind of our next project. Again, we have so much to do to catch up to society where the way cannabis is being used. We're so far behind. So I'm very antsy to answer more questions than we can, because it is a very difficult drug to study.
Well, terrific. Dr. Haney, thank you so much for taking time to speak with us, particularly about cannabis use disorder, what it is, what it isn't, what some approaches are to treatment. Really appreciate it.
I know, I really enjoyed it. I always enjoy talking to you, so I'm glad we had this chance.
Thank you very much.
If you like this podcast, please subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. For more information on the Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research at UC San Diego, please find us on social media at CMCR_UCSD on Twitter or X, Instagram, and other social media platforms, or visit our website at cmcr.ucsd.edu. Thanks for listening.